Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this research event from the Central School of Speech and Drama. My name is Tom Cornford and I organise and host these events for us. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce Shane. Firstly, Shane will speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll have about the same amount of time for questions. We'll see where they take us. If it's possible, could you please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom box on your screen, rather than the chat to ask questions. It just helps me to be able to find and manage them. That would be great. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Shane Boyle, who is a lecturer in drama, theatre and performance studies at Queen Mary University of London. His work engages widely with Marxist critical theory and the political economy of performance. In 2019, his book, his co-edited collection, Post-Dramatic Theatre and Form, came out from Bloomsbury, and I really recommend that engagement with the vexed question of the politics of post-dramatic theatre. And he is currently completing a book called The Arts of Logistics, and his talk tonight is taken from that project. He's also worked with a number of other people recently on keywords intervention on performance and political economy, which is coming out in the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism very soon. Open access, we think, potentially. So anyway, Shane, if you want to share your screen and get cracking, then we'll talk more when you finish. Thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to see you.
Great, thank you. Tom, can you see my screen and hear me?
Yep, I can see you, I can hear you. We're all good.
Fantastic, great. Okay, thank you all so much for coming tonight, or day, depending where you are. Thanks especially to Tom and everyone at the Central School of Speech and Drama for the invitation. I was thinking today that like the last thing I did in person before the pandemic was at Central. So in some ways it's good to be back in however mediated form. Also want to thank my partner, Morgan, who is currently downstairs keeping our 4-year-old from bursting into this room. That might happen at some point. So that'll probably be the highlight of this talk if that happens. And then I also just want to thank Antoinette Johnson, who worked as a research assistant over the summer, and the work Antoinette did really fed into the research that you're about to hear me present tonight. Okay, lots of other people I can thank, but I will leave it at that. Okay, so the work I'm presenting tonight is from the first chapter of a book I'm now revising, which is called The Arts of Logistics. And in this book, I study political economy and art since the 1950s, focusing specifically on how art and artists internationally have become entangled with the world of supply chains and logistics. The book focuses mostly on artists making art using actual logistical tools like shipping containers, oil barrels, pipelines, drones, and what I'll be talking about tonight, ships. I focus on how such logistical tools are actually used in art rather than how they are represented in, say, films or plays, partly to track how the world of art has become literally tangled up in the logistics infrastructure of global capital. There's a lot more I could say about my approach and argument, but I'm hoping that some of my take will come out in the course of the talk that follows. So the talk that I'm going to give is in 4 parts. It's going to last about 40 minutes or so. And in the first part, I'll say some things about what the grounding of Ever Given suggests about the role of salvage and loss in the calculated logic of supply chains. Then I try to situate the intense interest in Ever Given within a longer history of what I call salvage spectacles. About halfway through the talk, I'll make a sharp turn left or right, I don't know which, and try to historicize all of this by explaining how the ad hoc practice of salvage work was subsumed to capital in the 1800s. And in the fourth and final part, I'll conclude by finally getting to some examples of art made from the wasted remains of ships, on which I have a few thoughts. I'm going to be going back and forth between trying to manage a PowerPoint in this, so it might be a little jilty, so we'll see. Okay, for a week in late March 2021, the grounding of Ever Given revived one of the world's oldest pastimes, the spectator sport of salvage. Few who followed the 6-day drama that unfolded in the Suez Canal could deny the mixed feelings of delight and anticipation, curiosity and uncertainty that were evoked by this enormous floating warehouse jammed headlong into the bank. For many, the collective spectatorial experience may have seemed unusual, even unprecedented. And yet, in the history of capitalism, crowds have long been fascinated to watch other humans rescue wrecked ships, be they colonial frigates, luxury passenger liners, or ultra-large container vessels. The long history of what I call salvage spectacles can tell us something about how capitalism works, even when it seems like capitalism isn't working. Loss prevention efforts like the salvaging of Ever Given are not an exception to the workings of capital, but are in fact one logistical bulwark that allows capitalism to remain afloat. Apologies for all the metaphors. It is worth noting that even as the wreck of Ever Given may have seemed unusual, shipwrecks and other disasters at sea have become almost daily news in an era filled with people seeking refuge from the effects of war, climate crisis, and more. In the larger chapter, I address this in some depth, but tonight, when I talk about contemporary wrecks, I'll be focusing largely on those like the Ever Given, the only ones that seem to register on the quarterly reports of logistics companies. In centuries past, most salvage spectacles tended to be in-person affairs. Upon hearing word of a shipwreck, crowds would flock to coastlines to watch wrecking crews do their work. Sometimes salvage spectacles even involved a certain degree of, let's call it, audience participation, as spectators took it upon themselves to get in on the action, stripping stranded vessels for parts and cargo. But as with the case of Ever Given, salvage spectacles are and often have been highly mediated. Much of our encounter with Ever Given's grounding was shaped by the many artistic tributes it inspired, otherwise known as memes. You'll recall that the ship had cameos as Distracted Boyfriend or that fly on Mike Pence's face. You may remember TikTokers singing of its ordeal in sea shanties. Maybe you even consulted the guide on how to steal his look. There was also a website that provided constant updates to the question of the day: is that ship still stuck? But none of these tributes came close to the cruel optimism of the little digger that could. A single picture of a diminutive excavator doing its damnedest to dig out the enormous vessel became a screen on which we could all project all of our pandemic-fueled anxieties, injurious attachments, and chronic feelings of inadequacy. The fact that spectators experience Ever Given not in person, but in such mediated form, does not make the event unique. As we will see, salvage spectacles of the past reached their biggest audiences through accounts in newspapers and magazines, representation in paintings and performances. Much of what seems exceptional about the Ever Given spectacle is anything but. What is distinctive, perhaps, is the size of Ever Given. There's another one. What is distinctive, perhaps, is the size of the ship and the purported scale of the cascading disruption. A quarter-mile long, Ever Given's size is a textbook example of an epidemic known to industry insiders as naval gigantism, which has been caused by a multi-decade shipping arms race that has plunged the competitive business of ship owning into a state of chronic overcapacity. It's wreaked havoc with pricing, it's triggered bankruptcies and consolidations, and placed enormous demands on the landside infrastructure and labor needed to accommodate such ships. Ever Given's size is a marvel, but more remarkable seemed the ease with which it got so stuck and just how many other ships it managed to block. The awe inspired by Ever Given was truly ambivalent. We were impressed by what humans could make and how easily they could fuck it all up. Curiosity mixed with schadenfreude, as an offstage infrastructure seemed to have been dragged into the limelight. After nearly a week perpendicularly parked in one of the world's most important thoroughfares, an elite team of Dutch salvors collaborating with an unusually high spring tide, refloated the ship. As with all dramas, the climax was followed by a drawn-out denouement that few people paid any attention to. This one lasted 100 days, as the Japanese-owned ship and its largely Indian crew were essentially held for ransom in the aptly named Great Bitter Lake by the Suez Canal Authority, who demanded an incredible $900 million in restitution. In her spot-on synthesis of the public discourse surrounding Ever Given, Charmaine Chua sums it up all in this way. The workings of global markets, like those of microbes, are typically invisible, dissolved in the abstract, numerical, quasi-magical relations of capital flows. But this, a big boat got stuck. The stuck boat was big, and people had to get it unstuck. For a few days, the world seemed a little less inscrutable, brought down to scale by a simpler and more satisfying causality. As others like Lale Cleely and Aaron Jakes would argue, much of the response to the Ever Given spectacle took at face value the story that logistical capitalism likes to tell about itself, namely that it aspires to an ideal of seamless and continuous flow. The many comparisons of the Suez Canal to a blocked artery equated the circulation of capital with health, while overestimating the level of damage that this one boat could do to the economy. A definitive break in global trade as we know it was never something that Ever Given promised to deliver. After all, it already had 18,000 shipping containers worth of stuff on its manifest. While some might insist that a single stuck ship made visible the logistical workings of global capital, I am interested in what a salvage spectacle like this obscured. In getting blown off course, Ever Given conveyed an all too easy sense of global capital being stopped in its tracks. Let me be clear, the flow of global trade can be disrupted, and such disruptions can be a powerful tool in struggle. Just look at the amazing things that indigenous and BDS movements have accomplished in recent years by targeting railways, pipelines, and ports. But I want to push back some on those who would interpret Ever Given's grounding, as well as other recent supply chain disruptions, as sufficient evidence of a historical system in decline, or permanent decline. Instead, I want to do the work that Ever Given should have done, and that is foreground the essential place of salvaging in the capitalist world system. The chapter of my talk tonight comes from and tries to highlight the connection between the history of salvage and the contemporary logistical workings of capital. To connect salvage to logistics might seem surprising, given that logistics is often pitched as a science of getting the right thing to the right place at the right time. Where supply chain management relies on ideas of integration, control, and flow, salvage would seem to want wreckage, ruin, and disturbance. But salvage is not actually wreckage, ruin, or disturbance themselves. Salvage is the reward that's granted for limiting the losses incurred through such things. Salvage is one of many activities that capital depends on, but might otherwise prefer to disavow. In claiming a connection between salvage and logistics, I'm pursuing a lead left recently by Stefano, Harney, and Fred Moten in their book, All Incomplete, in which they argue that logistics is not just a science of moving property, but is also the science of loss prevention. Harney and Moten's supplemental definition of logistics troubles, I think, at least two key tenets of how people tend to understand logistics. First, it suggests that the principle governing logistical operations is not to produce or add value to products, but to keep losses to a minimum, specifically in transport costs. Loss prevention does not mean avoiding all loss. It means being able to count on some loss so as to secure a certain yield. It also means tolerating or distributing losses in the interest of capital, and often against the interests of those doing the work for capital, waged or not. Second, Harney and Moten's claim engages debates about the origins of logistics. Typically, the so-called logistics revolution sorry, I'll stop doing this, gets dated to the 1950s and 1960s, when some businesses and managers began reorienting their operations to tackle the integrated cost of transporting goods. It's also linked to containerization and offshore that picked up steam in the 1970s and 1980s. This historical account has come under some fire recently by critics like Lale Kalili, Liam Campling, and Alejandro Colas, who contend that even critical, ostensibly Marxist research on logistics tends to be too narrow and presentist. That's Campling and Colas's term. Instead, the likes of Kalili and others insist that more attention should be paid to a longer history of logistics and account for the significance of such developments as the rise of the steam engine and colonial expansion of the mid-19th century. Harney and Moten push us to look even further back. They posit the transatlantic slave trade as the 0 hour for modern logistics. In an earlier book, The Undercommons, they declared, modern logistics is founded with the first great movement of commodities, the ones that could speak. It was founded in the transatlantic slave trade, in the Atlantic slave trade, founded against the Atlantic slave. Harney and Moten do not tether logistics to specific technologies or management practices. For them, the term designates a mode of calculation, one riven with and generative of racism, and which can render body and flesh into property that can be stored and transported. In this definition, logistics is not about moving property necessarily or only about moving property, but about controlling how and whether that property moves. Logistics is obsessed with the prospect of loss, so they say, specifically, and I'm quoting them, the potential loss of property that can flee. To prevent loss, the logistics of the slave trade required restraints like manacles and chains, the constant threat and use of violence. But it also deployed more mundane forms of loss prevention, like efficient planning and hedging, techniques that wickedly turn all kinds of loss of goods, of life, into financial gain. Evidence of these seemingly mundane forms of loss prevention aroused much of the anger that fueled anti-slavery reforms in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Europe, in some parts of North America. The brutal planning efficiency displayed in the diagram of the Brooks slave ship and the insurance trial over the Zong murders demonstrated in visceral fashion how the political economy of the slave trade literally counted on the deaths of millions. As Marcus Rediker, Saadia Hartman, and others have argued, the brutal economic logic of the slave trade thought in terms not of loss, but of yield. In raising Harney and Moten's argument about logistics as loss prevention, I'm not looking to adjudicate debates over the origin debate for what now gets called logistics. I think it's fair to say that Harney and Moten themselves are less interested in correcting the historical record about a specific business field than in foregrounding the consistent place of loss in the workings of global capital across history. Salvage is one mechanism capital uses to count on loss. For Martin, Harney, and many others, emphasizing loss as a way to view our logistical present as the latest layer in a palimpsest that contains within it the marks of European empire and slavery. Ever Given got stuck in a channel dug with forced labor and maintained for 90 years under the auspices of French and British capital. It's a channel whose other most famous blockages came in 1956 and 1967, blockages that provided high watermarks for both decolonial struggle and post-colonial retrenchment. The Ever Given spectacle made literal this imperial palimpsest. That was the first and by far longest part of this talk. To speak of Ever Given as a salvage spectacle means situating it in a longer history of other such spectacles. Attempts to salvage wrecked ships have long captured the attention of audiences. The appeal of salvaging has less to do with the sheer fact of witnessing wreckage and more to do with the drama of rescue, that is, the effort to prevent loss. As with Ever Given, most salvage spectacles are highly mediated. Consider the prominent place that the imperial frigate, the Medusa, holds in cultural imagination. The Medusa wrecked in 1816 off the coast of present-day Mauritania. The reduced gunship was on its way to Senegal, where it was to re-establish the French colony for Louis XVIII. The cannibalism and murder that was committed aboard a raft salvaged from the wreck riveted the public. Written accounts by survivors circulated across Europe, prompting further representations like Giotto's painting, The Raft of the Medusa, as well as all kinds of melodramas, operas, and a panorama that toured the British Isles and France before venturing across the Atlantic. Many of the most popular salvage spectacles of the 19th century were experienced by crowds who attended shipwrecks in person. Exemplary here is the wreck of the enormous passenger liner, the St. Paul, which ran aground off the coast of New Jersey near the resort town of Long Branch during its final approach to New York in January 1896. Professional wreckers were joined by tens of thousands of people who traveled from all over to witness them work. Long Branch hotels eagerly accommodated this influx of off-season guests. Restaurants developed special menus that catered to them, and railroads ran special trains to get them there with speed. For those who could not make it, photographers and illustrators captured the scene for newspapers and also sold such images as souvenirs. As Jamin Wells writes in his excellent chronicle of the event, the sheer amount of attention paid to the St. Paul wreckage was extraordinary, but the fact that salvage was made into a spectacle and commodified for consumers in late 19th century America was, as he puts it, not exceptional. Shipwrecks were quite common at the turn of the century in North America, but also increasingly easy to get to thanks to the spread of train lines and the emergence of coastal towns with the infrastructure to host such crowds. Salvage spectacles have been found throughout the world. Thanks to its treacherous coastline, its shitty weather, and abundant trade, few places are more famous for salvage than the small, otherwise inconsequential island we call Britain. In her entertaining book, Wreckers, Bella Bathurst tells the apocryphal history of what she calls Britain's malevolent spectators, who upon learning of a wreck flock to nearby cliffs where they stand, quote, with their arms folded, waiting for ships to die. They pin their hopes on the failure of rescue so that they might take from the wreckage whatever they can get. Or we might want to project onto Bathurst's malevolent spectators some well-formulated anti-capitalist motive. She insists such behavior was driven often by simple need and sometimes infused with entrepreneurial spirit. Rumors abound of people setting conditions for shipwrecks to happen, be it passively by not replacing beacons or sea marks, or more actively. Bathurst tells stories of false lights and false foghorns, these are her words, false harbors, false rescuers, false dawns. Even stories of entire coastlines rigged meticulously as stage sets. But like some theater scholars who would claim on suspect grounds that people enjoy audience participation, Bathurst admits that such stories of malevolent spectators turned intentional wreckers also lack evidence. Despite the fact that salvage spectacles have been something of a constant in the capitalist world system, the meanings attributed to them seem to shift with time. If Ever Given conveyed a conflictual sense of the system's enormity and fragility, in the late 19th century, salvage spectacles are said to have signaled almost the opposite. Both the existence of huge ships and the ability of humans to rescue them testified to the technological achievements of capital and were read as signs of a system on the up. For all that salvage spectacles might obscure about capitalism, they also have the potential to reflect back to us constant truths about it. Writing in the 1950s, for instance, the Italian communist Amedeo Bordiga saw in a spate of maritime disasters resulting from shoddy engineering, the murderous result of an affluent capitalist society that plans for and profits from obsolescence. Intermission, and we're back. As the history of salvage spectacles suggests, salvage often makes for good business. In the 1800s, wrecks in the Bahamas were so common that some years the value of salvaged cargo could rival that of imports and make up around 2/3 of all exports. The Dutch outfit that freed Ever Given, Smith Salvage, is expected to fetch anywhere between $25 to $50 million when arbitration ends. Each year, Smith handles some 40 to 50 jobs, with most rewards being 10% of the estimated value of the hull and cargo rescued. In 2020 alone, their parent company, Boskalis, had revenues of €2.5 billion, about 1/8 of that coming from salvage rewards. The effort of rescuing stuff from the threat of ruin at sea is said to be as old as seafaring itself. But the activity of salvage assumed a particular social form when it started to be subsumed by capital in the 18th century. Up until the 1800s, salvage operations in the capitalist world system tended to be fairly ad hoc affairs, with crews decentralized and often amateur. The line between salvors, scavengers, and pirates is imagined in culture to have been pretty thin. Technological innovations in seafaring, like steam engines and iron hulls, combined with new forms of business organization to both deepen salvage's reliance on capital investment and transform wrecking crews into industrial operations. Steamships, for instance, cost a whole lot more than most wooden sailboats. And when they wrecked, the value of what could be salvaged rose immensely. Earlier salvage operations would have focused on saving cargo, but expensive steamships shifted priority to saving the vessel as well. Salvaging larger, heavier, and higher value ships required significantly greater outlays of capital. The result across the 19th and early 20th century was a general shift from ad hoc wrecking to more consolidated forms that could guarantee the investment, corporate organization, and specialized training that industrial salvage required. As with most kinds of work subsumed to capital, a key mechanism for tethering salvage to capitalism is the law, which is used to distinguish salvaging from those other activities it might otherwise be confused with, like, say, plunder, theft, or a voluntary act of heroism. Legally, the word salvage does not refer to the work that is performed, but rather the reward that one is entitled to for saving a ship or its cargo. The salvor must expect to get something from their act of rescuing, just not the actual stuff that is rescued. Salvage work entails, in other words, mutual legal recognition by the owner and those doing the work of salvage that the service performed is in fact that of salvaging. For the sake of time, I'm going to spare you the 1,000 words on salvage law that's in the chapter. All you need to know is that many of the players and legal mechanisms that make salvage law work today have their roots in European empire. For example, the international industry standard for arranging salvage is called the Lloyd's Open Form. That Lloyd's remains the standard bearer for salvage contracts is another reminder of the continuities of our logistical present with European empire. Lloyd's of London got its start in the 17th century as a coffee house market specializing in maritime insurance, covering not just cargo, but also slaves and colonial property. And Lloyd's remains the largest player in maritime insurance today. This is all to say that even as the very need for salvaging might seem to defy some logistical aspirations of capital towards seamless or continuous flow, salvaging has long been in service to capital. And as various writers like Anna Singh and Evan Calder Williams have argued, the very logic of salvaging, which Williams understands as a, quote, relentless search for every last scrap of value, is very much suited to capital accumulation. Like Harney and Moten's framing of logistics as loss prevention, the importance of salvage to global capital is a reminder that the grounding of a ship like Ever Given is something that capitalism literally counts on and even rewards. Okay. This is the last part. In the larger chapter, I argue that salvage serves both the logistical workings of capitalism as well as its cultural logic. Others, like Evan Calder Williams, who I've already mentioned, have made similar claims. But most writing about art and salvage focuses largely on representations of salvage, such as one that might be found in, say, the Mad Max films. My approach is pretty different in that I am primarily interested in artists who literally salvage and make art from the wasted remains of boats. I know that sounds ridiculous, saying that out loud. Okay, I'm realizing it's fine. Nonetheless, how I understand what a salvage aesthetic is owes a lot to existing methods of cultural criticism. In particular, Angela Naimu's recent book, Salvage Work, is especially important for me. For her, salvage is both an aesthetic and a reading practice, concerned specifically with coming to terms with the debris left in law and literature by the circumatlantic slave trade and its afterlives. Naimu focuses on the fragments resulting from what she calls the wreckage of legal personhood, rather than the actual fragments of shipwrecks. Her thoughts on salvage aesthetics are nonetheless instructive for my project. As she puts it, salvaging retains the historicity of junked objects and ostensibly junked legal categories by giving them new value and new functions without removing the traces of their ruination. It is less the economy of newness promised by recycling and more the aesthetics of collage or junk art. From this, I understand a salvage aesthetic to result in a kind of palimpsest, salvaging as an attempt to give new or restored function to what's been wrecked, while also trying to preserve the traces of previous ruin. I'll be breezing through some examples of artists making art by salvaging boats. And for the sake of time, I'm going to give priority to presenting the arc of my argument over actual close analysis or description of the examples. I assume some of you will know some, if not all of these. Some of you might not know any. For that, I apologize, but hopefully it's clear enough what these people are up to. And I'm happy to go into detail on any of this later in the Q&A or after the talk. Okay. Okay. I'll start with the Boyle Gamla Ensemble, a group whose practice exemplifies the overlap between the aesthetic of salvage and the actual work of salvaging. The Boyle Gamla Ensemble was active in London in the 1980s, and they combined performance art, sculpture, improvised music with a lot of fireworks. The group was made up of Anne Bean, Richard Wilson, and Paul Burwell. To give a sense of their work, consider the 1988 performance A Damned Near Run Thing. An image from it should be on the screen. Here they built a ramshackle structure on the Thames using a mix of materials ranging from oil barrels to bathtubs. They then proceeded to play this thing as a gigantic assemblage of musical instruments. To create works like this, the Boyle Gamla Ensemble actually salvaged their materials, gathering them from scrap heaps, shorelines, dumps, and more. Many of their performances entailed using actually ruined ships. Once they played a beached convoy of World War II era vessels like a set of drums, the tone and tenor of their instruments literally changing as the tide rolled in. Another time they raised and restored barges from the Thames to create a floating touring performance. They also reused a defunct shipyard one time as their stage and material. Theirs was an exemplary art of salvaging. As much as I love and always teach their performances, I think the Boyle Gamla Ensemble also indicates some political limits to salvaging as an aesthetic technique. Much of Bean, Wilson, and Burwell's work as the ensemble and also beyond explicitly engages with maritime history, specifically the decline of the London docklands in the late 20th century. Their performances are haunted by the specter of a maritime future that has been lost. But at times I have trouble deciding whether their work is hauntological in Mark Fisher's sense or just nostalgic. For me, it's an open question whether how they treat their materials offers too rosy of a view on England's shipbuilding history, and even the potential of steam, which figures prominently as a power source in much of their work. The Boyle Gamla Ensemble exemplifies the astonishing things artists can make by salvaging, but they also ask us to consider what it means to lament the demise of a working class history that was also thoroughly entangled with the workings of empire. My second example tonight is the artist Sai Guozheng. Most famous for his gunpowder paintings and work with explosives, and Netflix documentary about him. Sai's work is also filled with boats. From his landmark intervention at the 1995 Venice Biennale, critically commemorating Marco Polo, to his 2014 Beijing exhibition, The Ninth Wave, in which he retraced an imperial trade route by barge while transporting a Chinese junk boat filled with a motley bestiary of lifeless animals. I'm interested primarily in a strand of his work from the 1990s, in which Sai made a series of sculptures using wood that he salvaged from sunken Japanese trawlers. Of concern to him in these works was the unevenness between Japan's booming shipbuilding industry in the second half of the 20th century and that of China's, which while Sai was growing up, still used the kinds of wooden boats Japan had sent to the scrap heap. Created in the 1990s, these sculptures foretell a sea change already underway that would, within just a couple of decades, see China emerge as shipbuilder for the world. If Gamla Ensemble's salvage performances were haunted by European empire, Sai's work satirically registers certain racialized unease about Europe's decline and the coincident shift in global trade towards the Pacific over the last half century. My third example is the Global Mariner, a 160-meter long cargo ship that the International Transport Workers Federation paid a $3 million scrap price for in 1998. The ITF, through its hundreds of affiliated unions, claims to represent some 20 million transport workers around the world, including close to 1 million seafarers. They bought the cargo ship to retrofit it into a traveling photo and film exhibition that sailed around the world as part of the ITF's long-standing campaign against the use of flags of convenience in the shipping industry. This is a practice that allows ship owners basically to sail under whatever country's flag they want to avoid taxes, worker regulations, and things like health and safety standards. The Global Mariner set sail in 1998, and over the course of 20 months, traveled to over 80 ports in 51 countries, welcoming some 750,000 visitors on board. When compared to the many other ships out there that entrepreneurs have refunctioned into art galleries, the ITF's use of the Global Mariner to campaign for seafarer rights is hugely impressive. But I think it also signals some of the real political limits of repurposing the instruments of capital in the interest of labor. The entire Global Mariner voyage cost the ITF $9 million. And the ship sunk in Venezuela just months after it ended. And that's another story. It's not that I think this money could have been better spent, as if we should judge the class struggle using the metrics of value for money. Instead, the Global Mariner raises more straightforward questions about the strategies and tactics available and in use by international labor organizations. Specifically, how spectacular consciousness-raising efforts like this might displace other forms of action. And symbolically, the Global Mariner presents an all too easy vision of workers seizing the means of logistics. In saying this, I'll admit that it's hard for me to disentangle the ITF's actual messaging about the Global Mariner from how the Global Mariner has been presented by the artist Ellen Sekula, who traveled on the ship and documented its voyage. Sekula's account veers close to a fantasy of worker control as a magic bullet for undoing exploitation and dispossession. Sekula's vision risks assuming that things like cargo ships are neutral instruments that can be dislodged from the infrastructure of global capital by workers, and which, with some tinkering, can be effectively reused to other ends. I'll end with Selena Thompson's play Salt. Salt is a monologue performance that premiered in 2017, and for those of you who haven't seen it, is now streaming on BBC iPlayer in a kind of revised version. Thompson does not use any actual boats in her performance, although she does do a lot of wrecking using a large sledgehammer. The play is based on her experience retracing the maritime routes of the transatlantic slave trade aboard cargo ships. Much of what's been written about Salt focuses rightly on how Thompson gives voice to Black British diasporic experience and the deeply caring way she commemorates the lives of women lost and forgotten in the slave trade. Salt, I think, is also profound for how it ties together the slave ship with the container ship. While the play avoids conflating these kinds of vessels, Thompson insists that they be treated together as a palimpsest that foregrounds the continuities of our logistical present with European empires of the past. I think it is especially important that performances of Salt do not use actual boats. Sledgehammer in hand, Thompson salvages the debris of personhood, as Angela Naimu might put it, without attempting to give new purpose to a logistical tool of capital. In another world, the performance suggests, such things as our container ships would not be worth salvaging. That is it. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Shane. That was great. Really fascinating. I've got loads of, my little book is full of questions. We have a few in the Q&A. Thank you for typing them while you were listening, folks. While people add more to that and I have a chance to scan them, I just wanted to ask you a question about how this might relate to discourses of repair and reparation. I guess this, or maybe this is too big a question.
No.
I thought it was kind of nicely general, but I mean, I hear a lot, I guess we all hear a lot at the moment about reparative practices, about repair. Sometimes that seems kind of well-meaning, but under-theorized, other times more so. But I wondered, but when you were talking about Selina's show there, I was thinking about the way in which it kind of stages wreckage, but she hands out the salt as a kind of balm. Not only that, but partly that, you know, to audience members afterwards, and a burden. Exactly, yes. It's very ambivalent. But I just wondered how the notions of salvage might and the kind of wreckage that they bring with them might relate to discourses of repair and reparation politically.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a really good question, and one I admit that I haven't totally thought about. My first response would be that I think it's really important to note that the same word might have multiple meanings, and repair in a salvage context might have very different meanings than repair and say how Selina Thompson or Angela Naimu or someone else might use it. And I think that's super important to note. And I think that there are kind of different orders of repair and reconstruction being had. I haven't really used the word repair in this text or anywhere, actually. I think maybe one reason, I'm just kind of guessing at my own unconscious motives here. I think repair suggests something that salvage very much is not. It's suggesting that we can make it new, we can restore it back to how it was working. And my understanding of salvage is that actually it should, and it always does, keep or retain a sense of ruin. And if it doesn't retain that sense of ruin, then part of the task of artists and critics and people is to flag that previous ruin, so that we can kind of better understand that process of repair, note it's imperfect, note why it might have been done, note that it's imperfect. There's a lot there. And I mean, Thompson's play is there's just a ton to say about it, what the salt means. And I apologize for those of you who haven't seen or read it or watched it. It means so many different things, I think, but I think that's what's also kind of fascinating. She smashes the salt, but then she also uses it for a libation and a balm, and then she gives it to people to take themselves after they leave. And I think I love that because it just is full of tons of contradictions and ambivalences, and as you said, and I think that's something that needs to be restored to terms like salvage, and probably also repair, and definitely reparation, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Right, we're going to dig in. So an anonymous attendee, thank you for kicking us off, has said, thank you for your talk, and has asked whether you consider the transforming of salvage scraps into art to be an attempt at redefining logistics to encompass artistic value over monetary, I mean, it seemed like what you were saying is that you see the two as so kind of profoundly imbricated with each other that it's difficult to disentangle them like that. But is that right? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think I'd be really suspicious of artists who are saying that they can like completely like, you know, transform like salvage efforts into aesthetic practices and like completely like disconnect that from capital. And so I'd be really suspicious of that. And I think that is something I try to do, especially in some of the analysis of Sai's work and Boyle Ensemble's work, and others like Mark Dion and there's a ton of other people who kind of make that claim. The one thing I'm really, really interested is in like this distinction between salvaging as like an industrial operation and salvaging as an artistic practice. They like, in terms of their content and as concrete activity, they might like look fairly similar sometimes, but operate in different ways and follow along different kind of routes. Hopefully that's obvious, but also that I do think that there's a connection. I think often it's like when I was describing what I'm interested in this project out loud, I've been writing this. This is the first chapter of the book. It's the last chapter that I've written, and I literally have only spoken to like my dog about it, and like said these things out loud. So saying that I'm interested in artists who make art by salvaging but like ruined boats. Like I know that sounds absurd, but I also do think that like we can't just dismiss that as important and interesting and potentially. And I'm really trying to understand kind of what that sort of thing, which seems so removed from, say, Smith Salvage, like what if anything it can tell us about Smith Salvage, and also to really kind of understand like how, say, industrial salvaging operations came into being, i.e. how they're subsumed to capital, et cetera. And I agree with Sarah that dogs are good listeners. Thank you, Sarah, in the chat.
Yes, indeed. Sebastian's asking about more recent examples of salvage spectacles. Sorry, not more recent. I think more recent examples, if you see what I mean. And how the consumption of such spectacles has changed over the years. And there may be events that don't draw the same kind of attention anymore, and therefore aren't consumed in the same way.
That's another really good question. So obviously for this talk, I kind of condensed my genealogy or history of salvage spectacles. Kind of more recent ones, like the most obvious and most important, I think, are the ones that I mentioned at the start that usually don't appear on balance sheets of companies, and that is, you know, all of the boats that wreck full of people seeking refuge in Europe and elsewhere. So I think that's like that's an obvious one. I think the fact that those aren't, I don't want to say that they should be made into spectacles, but they aren't attended to like more. And this is such an obvious one, I think, like is itself telling in the way that I think Seb is suggesting or pointing to. I mean, there are others, you know, like the Costa Concordia, which wrecked in 2013. That was, I think, another big recent salvage spectacle. I haven't thought tons, I don't have much original stuff to say about that. Evan Calder Williams wrote a really, really good little think piece about it for the New Inquiry that I suggest people look at. I think the way he interprets it kind of helps to, similar to what some other comments about the Ever Given, I think that he really kind of captures the public discourse around that. But I think it's also actually kind of similar to what, how people consumed Ever Given, this kind of like amazement at this huge thing that could actually just like wreck so easily and cause so much like destruction. Obviously in Costa Concordia, the destruction was of a different kind, but yeah.
I'm gonna stay on history for a minute. Joshua's got a question about historicization.
Of course he does.
Yeah, about so whether these are not necessarily debates as such, but more just distinct claims. One being a claim about origins, that an inquiry that can only move backward as earlier and earlier instances of logistical ordering are recovered, and another about orientation, where we make historical claims about, say, when logistics become a dominant rather than adjunct feature of capitalism, or at what point there's a kind of greater capital investment in transport than in new factories. So is it an error, he is asking in summary, to stage it as a debate between logistics goes back to the Atlantic slave trade, or and there's a logistics revolution transforming global capitalism in the post-war period? Is that?
Yeah. I totally get what Josh was meaning, and I think this is the thing that I find kind of difficult about Harney and Moten's claims about logistics, is that like it's hard to tell if they're trying to like correct like an historical account, and or whether the way that they use the word logistics is different than how, say, like someone at Maersk uses the word. And I think that's really important to attend to that difference. And I think, yeah, I agree with, I think what Josh was suggesting here, that actually like that both of these things are true, and actually that like, and to a certain extent, I don't actually think that Moten and Harney are actually trying to set the record straight about definitively logistics began in 1492 or something like that. I don't think that's what they're trying to say. I think that they're trying to point out kind of like broader logics at work. But I do think that some people who interpret and also criticize Moten and Harney about what they say about logistics and how they treat it do like treat them as if they're entering into a debate. And that's, yeah. Joshua, I don't know if that, I hope that answers your question, but I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that they're, I guess, you know, that they're trying to evince something about the political stakes in these questions, rather than trying to pretend that they're historians, I think. But
yeah, I mean, they're clearly not historians, or they're not trying to LARP as historians either. I think that that's really important. But that's also what's really, really difficult. I mean, there's some things that they say about logistics that I think to say certain labor historians who might be, or labor sociologists who might be in this webinar, or maybe left already, you know, might like look askance at and question some of the claims.
There's another question about temporality, which kind of follows onto these questions about historicization, from Diana, who wonders how, this is in the chat, sorry Shane, if you're looking, I wonder how tending to how shipwrecks are constituted, for example legally, might unravel a particular articulation of capital and bodies in this moment. So then what is the relation between shipwrecks, temporalities and capital? And she's wondering how decolonial articulations of time might inform a different politics, or unravel the temporal binds of shipwrecks.
Okay.
That's an easy question.
Yeah, always brilliant things from Diana. Hold on, I wonder how tending to, let me just read it once more. Okay, yeah, I mean, there's a ton to say here. I think, we see that Charmaine has also entered into the Q&A, and I think that she's like said some really, really kind of, she and others have said some really amazing things about how Ever Given has very much effaced a lot of both salvage labor and also kind of the work of seafarers and their plight as well. And I think that's super interesting. I don't know if that starts to kind of get at what Diana is saying. But I do think that like one thing that runs through a lot of salvage spectacles, at least in kind of the history that I've charted and stuff that and the historians I've been reading, is that there's this thing that happens where people go to watch and are really interested in salvage work, but actually are either literally too far away from the wreck, or just like it doesn't show up on their Twitter feeds to see the actual people doing the things that salvage requires. Instead, they focus on like the boats, they focus on the dredgers, the cranes, that sort of stuff. And Jamin Wells has like a really, really good discussion of how this kind of evokes a kind of technological sublime of salvage. And I think that that actually hasn't, I'm not convinced that that has necessarily changed, at least in like 150 years. Maybe if we go back to some older things that could be salvage spectacles, that would, but I kind of cap my my time period, or I bracket it around 1800. But yeah, I hope that at least kind of addresses us somewhat, but maybe it doesn't. Oh, but there's stuff about law there too. Yeah, okay. I'll hold off. Maybe it'll come back or maybe she'll have other things, yeah.
Should we move on to what Charmaine's saying about this, sort of picking up on Joshua's question, which I think this is related to what Diana was asking as well. So what do we gain in our understanding of capitalist development from identifying logistics' historical starting point? So is there a different political consequence to calling the slave trade logistical, or identifying its rise in the 1960s?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Do we call it logistical or imperial, or how are those things different?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to like, I'm totally happy to like use the word logistical to describe like transport activities since like the 1950s and 60s, and to not say that like things happening in the 1700s were called logistical, because they weren't, or if they were, it was within like things done by armies, and that's where logistics comes from, as Charmaine knows. But in terms of political consequences, I think like one thing that really, really matters is like, and why I kind of side with Moten and Harney here and trying to like emphasize this longer history, and I know others do as well, is that like it does kind of inform how we orient struggle and our analysis, and it kind of helps us to like think that the enemy isn't containerization. The enemy is like much bigger and much different. And I think that like is how it's politically useful. That's my short answer to that really, really good question that builds off Joshua's also really good question. But that would be my first like response.
Yeah, it's an excellent answer. Thank you very much. I'm going to move over to Tony's question about bataille. So this is leaping around. So he's asking about the relation of, say, sot to secula. They seem quite different. So he said that what you were saying brought to mind bataille's idea of the accursed share, which is in a sense a political economy of waste, or of the unsalvageable. So waste stands in an interesting relation to luxury in bataille, and I wondered to what extent art performs the function of salvaging the unsalvageable, and there's a form perhaps of cultural reappropriation, whereas a performance such as salt seems to work in a different register or a different direction.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad Tony picked up that there is supposed to be a connection between the Global Mariner and Selena Thompson's work, because I talk about them kind of together in the chapter, partly as a way to like get at this thing that I think is at work in Secula's essay and photographs of the Global Mariner, which have this kind of like, I'll call it like a fantasy vision of, maybe that's like, maybe Secula is such like kind of like a sacred figure, like for a lot of kind of leftists. But you know, I think that like in his treatment of the Global Mariner, there definitely is this kind of surprising fantasy of worker control and of seizing the ship. And, you know, he has all this stuff where he says that like this cargo ship is so great because it has its own cranes on it. It doesn't need to rely on cranes at the port of Oakland or Rotterdam to be able to load and offload goods. These people are self-sufficient. It's like, it's this really strange romanticism such that it's hard for me to wonder if he's not just like taking the piss, as people say in this country. So, and I think that like Thompson's work really, I know that she probably would not even think to like stage this on a real container ship. So it's kind of absurd, like like proposition, and I don't think that she should do that. But I do think that there is something kind of striking to me that she makes this work. She goes on these cargo ships and she has this like extremely intense and borderline, probably traumatic experience on them. And then she makes this work and completely stages it very clearly in a black box theater. The BBC version is different. A lot of it's on a beach and elsewhere. But I do think that there's something significant about that refusal to even pretend like this stuff can be used. And I think that there's something that's an aesthetic gesture, but it's also, and it's obviously out of necessity. Like she probably wasn't going to get the Arts Council to like let her pay $3 million to buy a cargo ship, like the ITF had at hand to do. But I do think that there is like kind of political like lesson that can be drawn from that. The stuff about Bataille, Tony, I'm going to be like really honest, and I'm not as familiar with the Bataille stuff, and the question has disappeared, so I can't revisit that. But maybe it's in dismissed. But
yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
sorry, it's under dismissed. Shane, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But yeah, I see. So the status of waste, I'll kind of go with here is. I find it really interesting to think in terms of waste and junk, to think of some of the differences between that and rubbish. And there's the whole thing called rubbish theory, which I'm sure some people have waded into. And it aligns some with what Amy or Sean via Amy, I kind of see in the text kind of are getting at with Singh's book. So maybe that make for like a good kind of transition. That like salvage, I don't think is approaching things in terms of waste. I would say it's not thinking that things are wasteful. It's thinking of things that are at threat of being ruined or lost, and it's trying to like recover that. So it's not wasted stuff; it's ruined stuff. And I think that there's a really, really important difference there that I would really, really want to push at. And I will read the Bataille actually and see if that kind of helps me kind of unpick some of this stuff.
Yeah, there's a really good question about planetary futurity from Sean. So I'm gonna read that out. So he says that he knows that Singh has a different take, but it seems to him that salvage accumulation, like primitive accumulation, term which has been brought considerably back into currency on the left in recent years, suggests a logic of new beginnings from capitalist ruins, even if, at least narratively, one would appear to occur at the beginning and the other at the end of the long arc of accumulation. And this narrative arc seems important, since any suggestion that accumulation might be renewed in the present would seem to fly in the face of the growing pile of evidence that the era of growth is over and isn't coming back. So if the notion of salvage suggests both wreckage and renewal, might another limit to the art of salvage alongside those you outlined be its participation in a fantasy of future accumulation that disavows the foreclosure of planetary futurity that climate change portends?
Yes, Sean. I know. Yeah, I know. I'm not saying that dismissively. Like I very much agree. I think so. Singh's book is like a wild book. I'm sure like some people have read it. It's about like mushroom foraging. And it tries to think about like salvage as what she calls like a translation process of like how, say, things produced or generated outside of capitalist production process are kind of brought into like circuit of capital, or brought to market, that sort of thing. And I think, so in a lot of ways, her work isn't like super relevant to what I'm interested in and trying to engage with, but I do think that like the basic claim that she makes that capital is really, really interested in finding all of the ways that it can potentially accumulate capital by looking outside of its own capitalist production process, i.e. into nature and other things, I think is probably hopefully getting at kind of where Sean is going. So I would agree with that. And then the fiction or the unreality of that is like definite. And especially when you start bringing in to temporality, like futurity and all of that. So that's just to say, I really agree with Sean on that reading and on that kind of spin on Sing.
Yeah, I actually had a slightly domesticated version of that question, which was about the ways in which it might expose kind of projects of reappropriating abandoned warehouses, by, this is kind of a familiar trope of late 20th century cultural production. But I wondered to what extent you might think that salvage, the logic of salvage spectacles might apply to the ways in which I was thinking specifically actually of Minneapolis, where the Guthrie Theatre, there's this massive sort of huge theatre on the banks of the river, and then next to it there's an old flour mill which is kind of half destroyed. There was a huge explosion in it.
Cool.
And it becomes kind of, so that becomes kind of there's a sort of spectacular display of industrial decline, I guess, associated with sort of gentrification, middle class cultural production. I just wondered to what extent you might see like those, even once they're empty, those warehouses kind of being salvaged and art being caught up in that logistical process.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I totally took out of this talk was any mention of salvage architecture and that sort of thing. And Evan, who I don't think he's here, or he's gone, has written some really, really fun and good takes on that. Yeah, so I'm trying to be really, really disciplined so as to contain this chapter and to keep it at a manageable length. And so I've been really resistant to talking about salvaging of anything other than boats. I know that sounds ridiculous, but hopefully there's like a reason for that. But where you're, so I don't have a ton to say. I don't know about how salvage law works or whether it works in instances like that. I'm sure insurance law comes into play. And I know that like in the history of salvage, fire brigades used to be called, I think, like salvage crews and that sort of thing. So there is kind of the same logic in history there. Obviously a big difference between fire brigades and salvage crews today is that salvage crews tend to be private, invested with capital, whereas fire brigades tend to not be. That's changing, I'm sure, in some neighborhoods. Obviously, they depend on their private police forces and salvage crews to protect their communities, etc. I think your talk also links to, or your question also links to something that I engage in another chapter of the book, which is about shipping containers and kind of the huge boom in their use in architecture, but also in art and performance. And one thing I say in that chapter is I try to think about the container as the new loft warehouse for performance and that sort of thing. And so I do think that in the case of the container, there's I try to work through this a little bit in the chapter, there's some salvaging of containers, but actually a lot of shipping containers that are used for things like box park or performances or galleries tend to increasingly be new containers because for various reasons. But I think that's really interesting, that pretends that these containers have been salvaged or rescued from ruin or repurposed or whatever, but actually a lot of them are just being, well, maybe not now because container prices are through the roof, but a lot of them would be straight from Chinese factories and shipped to the UK or shipped to Australia, and then artists can make their immersive performances in them. But while nonetheless kind of pretending that this stuff actually was built for and was used in kind of global trade.
There was a question about oil tankers and spillage, I guess, rather than salvage, and whether you would see that as a kind of quite a different kind of event and quite a distinct sort of thing to container ships running aground or somehow becoming wrecked and spilling their contents.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So two things. I'll keep saying that they all are great questions, and not just like being patronizing. That's a fun one. So an interesting thing about salvage law, and I took this out of the talk, was that like, there has been some pretty like important changes to salvage law and the practice of salvage in the last 20 or 30 years. And probably the main one is that newly important and something that's newly required of salvage crews is that in addition to trying to retrieve cargo or to rescue boats, is that they're oftentimes sent out also to contain like leakages and spills and to prevent or like help to limit losses to coral reefs and that sort of thing. And so there's something, so I do kind of get at this in this chapter, but the reason why I don't talk about oil tankers that much in this talk is because I have a chapter on oil barrels and on pipelines. And the tanker there is really, really interesting to me because the tanker and the pipeline are both these like ideals that a lot of the logistics literature from the 1950s and 1960s posits as the solution, as the way to automate logistics and transport. And oftentimes they pitch the oil tanker and the pipeline as the antidote to the oil barrel, which requires people to like pick up these barrels, roll them, move them, all this sort of stuff. So there's this fantasy of automation going on there that I get at. And I also write about some artists who like use oil as art and like, show off like just pools of oil and say like, let's meditate on eternity by looking at this giant pool of oil, which is super strange and weird. There's a lot more that could be said about like the rise of oil tankers and container ships that I'm not going to get into, and how oil tankers, their size kind of capped out in the late 70s, while container ships, their size continued to expand. Ale clearly has basically written all the definitive stuff on that, so I don't have anything original to say about that history. But I think, yeah, that's kind of a spot on question here for kind of the stuff I'm thinking about. Thank you, anonymous attendee.
So I guess I have one closer, which is, I suppose, a few times in the talk, you sort of seem to suggest that there's something resistant in materials to reappropriation. That there's a kind of political valency to objects and materials, which artists have to work very hard to work against, and even then kind of fall foul of its capacity to somehow almost rebind itself with with the purposes for which it was intended or something. Is that fair, or is that a sort of fantasy reading of what you're suggesting?
No. Yeah, I think, and that kind of gets at like one of like the basic like methodological premises or starting points for the book is like, I really from the start I wanted to try to see what could be done if we approach logistics not by watching superhero films and commenting on all the like shipping containers in them and why that is, although I think that like critical method is really, really useful. That kind of Marxist symptomatic reading ideology critique is really, really necessary. But I wanted to kind of see what could happen when we like literally like looked, or when we looked at like how artists are literally using this stuff. And I think, one, it's not like some way to like say we need to get away from like deep interpretive hermeneutic work, etc., and flip to like surface reading. It's not like some strange kind of like flip into me being a new materialist or anything like that. I don't think that these things have like agency unto themselves. But like what I'm really, really interested in is kind of making that, like putting that claim out there, like what happens when we like actually just sit with the infrastructure for a bit. But I also think that there's a lot of like interesting things that can be said or that I've discovered by doing this. Like one, for instance, is I have a chapter on drones. And it's kind of amazing how many like artists who are working with drones are either directly or indirectly funded by like big logistics companies and arms manufacturers. Like my big example is Cirque du Soleil. They had this performance on Broadway a couple of years ago that then went to Germany that had drones in it. And the people who designed the drones were the very same founders of of Kiva Systems, which is the company that provided all the robots to Amazon's fulfillment centers. And so there's this strange, weird thing going on there, in which artists, by using this stuff, literally get entangled with the infrastructure of global capital. And I'm trying to, and in some ways that in some cases, especially with the stuff on Salvage, a lot of the readings I do tend to be kind of you kind of do this, you kind of make the same claims about reading photographs and films, a lot of the claims that I make. But with some of these other technologies and tools, it gets really much more infrastructurally complicated and tricky, I think. Global Mariner is obviously a big exception here. That's kind of more like what I do with some of the rest of the book, but yeah.
Well, thanks, Shane. It sounds brilliant. When's it going to be? You're finishing it now, right?
Yeah, hopefully I'll send it out in December, but depends on what reviewer 2 says about it. So we'll see. If you're reviewer 2 on this call, if you will be, then yeah, play nice.